Our next founder is Isaac Sears. Isaac Sears was a ship captain who made a lot of money. And eventually, by the age of 33, he was able to, I don't want to say retire, but move to New York City, leave the seas behind him, and start actually a merchant business where he hired other people to steer the ships. So Sears does this. He makes a whole lot of money, and as things start coming in, as these revolution starts a brewing, well, he becomes an important member of the New York Sons of Liberty, and the New York City chapter of the Sons of Liberty is very important. Boston Sons of Liberty gets a lot of credit, rightfully so. And when we hear the phrase Sons of Liberty, most of us kind of default in our brains to Boston. There were Sons of Liberties throughout the colonies, and New York's was, I'd argue, number 2 in importance. One of the reasons is Isaac Sears was out there just being Isaac Sears about things, and being a really important leader. In fact, he was able to assemble a mob very quickly to the point where he earned the nickname King Sears, because his ability to just go out and in half an hour get 100 people riling in the streets. And I should note that when I use the term mob, that was the term they used at the time, and it doesn't have the inclinations that it has necessarily today. Today you think a reckless mob just going out and causing destruction. In a fashion, that is what happened with mobs, and that is how the elite often looked at them at the time. But mobs were considered a political tool. At a time where most people didn't have the right to vote, a mob would get together and go and shout in front of someone's house. Also, it is important to note that the elite, as we or they would call them, lived in the same cities and right in the same towns as everyone else. So you could literally get a mob and go to the governor's house. And there wasn't much to stop you. There was, of course, militias, but they had to get called out, and they didn't always get called out in time. And it was a way for the people who did not have franchisement to be able to go to the government and say, we're angry, change what you're doing. And Isaac Sears, King Sears's ability to assemble these mobs so quickly was extremely important, not only early on for the Stamp Act Congress and against the Stamp Act, but later on throughout the early buildup to the American Revolution. He was arguably one of the top most important movers and or shakers in pre-revolutionary New York. Now, I do want to talk about the Battle of Golden Hill. Isaac Sears was a leader at the Battle of Golden Hill. What was happening is the patriots in New York would erect a liberty pole to say, you're doing a bad job, King and Parliament, and then the redcoats would take it down. And then they'd put another one up and take it down. And then the patriots would put up pamphlets, and then the British would take them down. And they'd put up more pamphlets and take them down. And eventually, a soldier actually put out, a British soldier put out a pamphlet which attacked Sears and the Sons of Liberty and essentially accused them of terrorism. What we would consider terrorism, not what a word they would use back then. But this all boils over on January 19th, 1770, when a group of redcoats attempt to post a notice against the Sons of Liberty. They're basically saying, no more meeting as a Son of Liberty. And Sears, King Sears, assembles one of his mobs, and the mob gets together, and they go down towards the mayor's office. And there are a bunch of redcoats who sound the alarm, and they come out, and they're ready to put down this mob. Unfortunately for them, they realize there's a whole lot more people in this crowd than there are of us. And interestingly enough, there was some scuffling. Now, no one was killed, but there was some violence here, and people were injured. And then everything settled down. Now, this was 6 weeks before the Boston Massacre, more famous, but in a similar situation where it was a few soldiers and a big crowd. Now, the Boston Massacre, people were killed, and that's why it was so much more outrageous. But 6 weeks before that, in January of 1770, the Battle of Golden Hill was a battle where a few people were a little hurt, but it was the first violence, from my perspective, of the American Revolution. There are other mobs in Massachusetts, yada, 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 but this is the first one that we call a battle, even though it kind of wasn't. It was more of a hostage situation, but still. It is the first violence in New York, and it really is arguably the first violence of the American Revolution. Though, of course, the war itself doesn't start for 5 more years. And I do like to bring this up because it does reiterate how important not just Boston, but New York and other cities were in the lead up to the Revolutionary War. Now, as for Sears himself, He plays a role in New York's early revolutionary government, and he's actually recommended by John Adams for a naval command, though he does not receive one in the Continental Navy. When the British take over New York City, he obviously flees New York City, doesn't want to be hanging around with the British. He goes back to his old job of captaining a ship, where he acts as a privateer throughout most of the war, makes a lot of money, makes a fortune. And then, very interestingly enough, after the war is over, he attempts to be one of those first people to open a trade between North America and China. And he sails to China, but sadly, almost as soon as he arrives there, he falls ill and passes away. And he was buried in Canton Harbor. He is the first American and possibly one of the only founders to be actually buried in China. So that's a really interesting wrap up. And for Isaac Sears, just an extraordinarily important, almost, I want to call him a Sam Adams of New York, arguably, because of the way he could get the rabble to rouse. So that is an overview of the life of Isaac Sears.